Hi, this is Ed Driscoll, and via the magic of the internet and help from the folks at pjtv.com, I'm able to talk today with the blogfather himself, Glenn Reynolds of instapundit.com, the author of the new book, The Higher Education Bubble. It's published by Encounter Books and available in both hard copy and Kindle format from amazon.com. And Glenn, thanks for stopping by today to this edition of Silicon Graffiti.
Great to talk with you, Ed. I love your show.
Thank you. Hey, in a way, this edition of Silicon Graffiti is sort of like the Avengers, except on a much, much lower special effects budget, and starring two guys you do not want to see in spandex. But we've got Silicon Graffiti meets Insavision all in one video. Glenn, when you started blogging, did you see yourself hosting your own internet TV series?
No, I have to say I didn't. I sort of actually tried to invent the podcast a few years too early and fiddled around with some audio stuff, but never quite made that work. But video I thought was well beyond what I could do with my 2000 vintage computer and internet connection.
Well, speaking of the early noughts, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this as a video interview is that my blog just celebrated its 10th anniversary earlier this year. Your blog will celebrate its 11th anniversary in August. For viewers who weren't there at the beginning, could you talk a bit about what led you to blogging and the state of old and new media back then?
Well, it was funny. I was, I guess, sort of at the end of the first wave of bloggers. At least that's how somebody put it to me once. When I started blogging, there were a few people blogging. There was Virginia Postrel, Mickey Kaus, who's I think the first blog I actually encountered, Andrew Sullivan, Joanne Jacobs was blogging, but it was a pretty short list. I read their blogs for a while, and I thought, you know, this is something I could probably do. And I ran across the Blogger platform back when Ev Williams was still running it out of his basement, and gave it a try. It was even then very easy to just set it up from blogger.com. And, you know, I thought it would be fun. I was teaching internet law, and I tried to do a variety of sort of hands-on internet things to, you know, keep my hand in. And I kind of thought I'd try it for a while and then move on to something else. But now I've been doing it for 11 years almost. It's hard to believe.
I know what you mean. Today, the line between blogs and old media has completely blurred. And old media really doesn't like that idea very much, do they?
No, they don't, although it's funny because you see it at both sides. Blogs are doing lots of original reporting now. So in that sense, they're kind of acting like old media was supposed to. But at the same time, old media has gotten a lot bloggier, not least because they're facing all these budget and personnel cuts, and it's frankly just a lot cheaper to sit there and post links and make snarky comments than it is to go out and do actual coverage. So there's been this sort of weird convergence. But I noticed in sort of a semi-annual event, some old media guy was complaining that bloggers are ruining things yet again today, and some bloggers were smacking him down. So, you know, that seems to be a standard cycle.
Well, even as they incorporate blogging into their mix, old media still sees itself as very much an elite aristocracy who cannot accept that they've lost serious ground in the world over the last 15 years or so. And that's not too distant from the worldview of academia, is it? I mean, present company accepted, of course.
Well, no, and actually that's a very interesting remark, because you're right. You know, the press saw itself, and when they refer to themselves as the fourth estate, that really suggests that they're sort of part of the machinery of government, which is odd for an entity that's supposed to be a watchdog on the powerful. But they definitely saw themselves as sort of part of the aristocracy. And but they also could tell, you know, as recently as 10 years ago, they knew they were in trouble. And I can remember having these lunches with people from newspapers and magazines and such. And the theme would sort of be, well, yeah, our business model is doomed and things are going to go down the tubes, but I figure it'll probably last till after I retire, so at least we got that. Now I have those conversations with academics. And of course, academics, too, have this weird dual vision of themselves. On the one hand, sometimes it's all about speaking truth to the powerful and being an outside voice, but at the same time, you know, modern academia is really a descendant of medieval clerics and guilds, and has its own sort of sense that it's part of the power structure as well, and they're having trouble reconciling those. And now academics will tell you, yeah, our business model is screwed. We're charging too much. We're delivering too little. People are going to find alternatives. But, you know, it'll probably hold together in more or less the current state till I retire anyway.
Well, that sounds a lot like the conditions that occur when an investment bubble is about to burst. And in your new book, you compare the higher education bubble with the housing market bubble. How are the two similar, and what causes an investment bubble to form and then burst?
Well, in both cases, what you have is a product whose price is climbing much more rapidly than family incomes. And it's doing so because people can make up the gap with cheap money, essentially government subsidies. Interestingly, and there's a graphic in the book that really illustrates this beautifully from Professor Mark Perry, who's an economics professor. It is the case that housing costs, which we thought rose so quickly, and healthcare costs, which we hear are rising so quickly, are absolutely dwarfed by the increase in college tuition costs. College tuition costs over the last 30 years or so have averaged 7.45% a year increase, which is pretty much double the rate of inflation and much more than housing or medical care. And people have made up the difference with credit. And they've done that because the credit was readily available. Universities pretty much push it on students and actually get fees for originating it, much as in the subprime mortgage crisis. And I think it's only recently that people have realized how burdensome student loan debt can be. And I know if you watched the sort of pop financial advice shows 5 or 10 years ago, they would often tell you that student loan debt was good debt because it was an investment. It wasn't like consumer debt. Now they say student loan debt is bad debt because it's not dischargeable in bankruptcy, as is consumer debt. And indeed, I've seen them advise people to take their $100,000 in student loan debt and try to convert it into credit card debt because then you can get out from under it in bankruptcy.
Well, last fall we had the rise and then the sort of slow-motion train wreck collapse of Occupy Wall Street. Were you surprised that many of the occupiers were as obsessed over their student loans as they were Wall Street's woes?
No, because the student loans actually hit them in their own pocketbooks. The Occupy movement, it was sort of an interesting display of frustration. And the occupiers were disproportionately people who had gone to pretty well thought of schools and run up a substantial amount of debt, typically in majors that had no real prospect of generating a very substantial income. Things like gender studies, or there was one guy who had gotten his master's degree in puppeteering and run up a huge student loan balance, only to discover that there's really not a lot of money in puppeteering. So, you know, there were a lot of people like that, and you know, in one sense, I do feel sorry for them because they're screwed. They owe all this money. You can't get it discharged in bankruptcy. They have no realistic prospect of ever earning enough to pay it back. And I can understand their feeling that they've sort of been betrayed, that the system lied to them and promised them things that it never really expected to deliver. On the other hand, it's like, really, who borrows $150,000 to major in gender studies and expects a job that's going to pay it back?
Yeah, and that's a question I wanted to get your take on. What caused colleges to offer degrees such as 20th century post-colonial deconstructionist lesbian poetry studies? And why did so many students think that these things were a good idea versus a more traditional law degree, business degree, medical degree, teacher's degree, etc.?
Well, two reasons. Colleges were responding to demand. The students wanted to take these majors because, frankly, they were easy. And a lot of times faculty members wanted to teach them because they're probably pretty fun to teach and certainly don't require any great degree of rigor. So, you know, you had demand from the people who were paying the money and the people who were doing the work who sort of control the institution. And students didn't think about this because, you still hear this today, people will tell you something like, a college degree will increase your lifetime earnings by $1 million. Well, on average, college degrees do increase your earnings, but you don't graduate with an average college degree. You graduate with a degree in something. And if you've got a degree in electrical engineering or nursing or something like that, your earnings are going to be boosted substantially. If you graduate with a degree in puppetry, probably not. That's the degree that's pulling the average down, but they don't tell you that.
So, will the collapse of the higher education bubble cause big education, as the late Andrew Breitbart might have called it, to rethink their model?
Well, you're already seeing some of that, you know, at several levels. Several top universities, Stanford, Yale, MIT, and such, are putting courses online and are clearly positioning themselves to mass market an online version of their degree, which I think will be actually quite successful at competing with a lot of existing brick and mortar institutions. I mean, I'm not sure that an online degree from MIT is as valuable as a degree you get by actually attending MIT, but I can easily imagine that it's more valuable than a degree from a lot of fourth-tier schools, even if you actually show up. The other thing that's going on is schools that aren't doing that yet are shaking in their boots and trying to figure out what to do. And the recent scandal at the University of Virginia, where the president was fired by the Board of Visitors, then reinstated by the Board of Visitors, basically stems from an internal argument over how to deal with these changes. They know their existing business model is unsustainable, and they're looking for ways to adapt. And some schools are going to do fine. The Ivy League schools will probably do fine. They've always got a role as a place for the children of the elite to meet and marry. Top engineering schools, MIT, Caltech, Georgia Tech, places like that will be okay. Flagship state schools will probably be okay. At least that's what we hope at my flagship state school. But there are a lot of schools out there that cost as much as Harvard, where you can easily graduate with six-figure debt, but that don't really bring that much to the table in terms of reputation, placement, or teaching you anything tremendously useful. Those places are going to take a big beating. And even the places that survive and flourish are going to have to refocus on providing value. Because when a college degree costs $250,000 or more, it has to have return on investment. Back when the tuition was so low that you could work your way through by waiting tables, when I started college, my tuition was $170 per quarter, and that included my activity fee. And in today's money, that would still only be about $500 or $600 a quarter. So something you can really pay by waiting tables. Well, now you can't do that. Colleges have gotten so much more expensive because the costs have gone up so much faster than inflation and income.
No, exactly. As you write in your new book, the almost mandatory nature of the college diploma helped to fuel those skyrocketing costs. After World War II, the bachelor's degree became the equivalent of the high school diploma. You had to have one to get a white-collar job. Though as you write in the higher education bubble, it basically signifies that you can show up in the same place every day, take notes, and pass tests. Are we reaching a point where the college degree is no longer mandatory to succeed in life?
Well, it's interesting that we have some of these big successes. Everybody always likes to talk about Bill Gates or Steve Jobs or something, who dropped out of colleges. Now, the interesting part is they dropped out of elite colleges. Bill Gates dropped out of Harvard. Steve Jobs dropped out of Reed College in Oregon, which is a fancy liberal arts school. And that actually tells you something useful. What people get from those colleges is actually not that much. There's been research that says that people who are accepted to Ivy League schools and then don't go do exactly as well as people who are accepted to Ivy League schools and do go. That what the Ivy League schools actually do is sort for people who are going to be successes in the future and then take credit for them, as well as pocketing some money along the way. I think that means that there's a real market for somebody who can do the same thing. In essence, certify people as able without making them spend 4 or 5 or 6 years and several $100,000 for the certificate. And I think that's a killer app, and you're already beginning to see it in some narrow areas where certifications are starting to rule. I think you'll see a lot more of that down the line.
Glenn, you may have mentioned this a few moments ago, but isn't the internet one solution to repairing the damage after the higher education bubble bursts? You and I are on opposite coasts about 3,000 miles apart, but we're able to converse together more or less as if we're in the same room. At some point, won't an increasing number of college lectures be done that way?
Yeah, I think that's quite likely. I mean, there really are big advantages to having everybody in the same room, particularly in a seminar-type setting where you've got a wide-ranging discussion. But the fact is, an awful lot of classes are taught in big lecture halls where you've got a professor standing in the front and 200, 300, 400 students watching. And actually, more often, it's a teaching assistant standing in front and 200 or 300 students sitting there watching and sometimes trying to understand fractured English. And those, it seems to me, could easily be replaced with online classes. I mean, there's not a lot of interaction one-on-one in a big class like that anyway, so you're not losing that much. And maybe you get somebody who's really good at delivering a lecture instead of some teaching assistant who's just doing it because none of the tenured faculty want to teach that class and they've got to earn their stipend. So I think you could easily see a higher quality education in those kind of classes using internet technology. And in fact, on a lot of campuses, the live lectures in classrooms are in fact recorded and put online so students can watch them from their dorm room later. So those students really wouldn't be missing anything.
Well, we'd like to thank those who've been watching this recorded discussion. We've been talking with Glenn Reynolds of Instapundit.com about his new book, The Higher Education Bubble. It's published by Encounter Books and available in both hard copy and Kindle format from Amazon.com. And Glenn, thank you very much for stopping by today.
Thanks for having me.
For Silicon Graffiti at pjmedia.com, this is Ed Driscoll.